Videos like this are made possible by my wonderful supporters on Patreon. Check the link below if you'd like to join them, and even get access to exclusive content. When it comes to my channel, there are two things that I like to make videos about: racing and racing games. Japan's Super GT Championship is one that I always find myself coming back to, but its history in gaming is somewhat erratic. It all started in the late 90s as the real-life series was rapidly increasing in popularity. To begin with, there were a handful of licensed All-Japan GT Championship titles for the original PlayStation, and later an entry on the Nintendo 64 and even the Game Boy Advance. However, none of them reviewed particularly well at the time, or are fondly remembered in current day. At best, they act as an interesting time capsule for the JGTC era. Beyond these, there really isn't much else to say. There's only been a single official Super GT game since then, 2018's Sega World Drivers' Championship, a Japan-only arcade racer. It's good for what it is, but fairly shallow in terms of gameplay. Although there haven't been many proper Super GT games, that doesn't mean that cars from the series haven't appeared elsewhere. In fact, for a while, these machines were a staple of the racing game scene. It was Gran Turismo that really established this trend, with many other franchises throughout the 2000s following suit. I believe that this saturation is the main reason why they stopped making official titles during this period, because when it came to Super GT and racing games, it was already well represented. But now, 2 decades on, things are in a very different place. A few months back, I made a retrospective on Super GT and Gran Turismo, in which I highlighted the fact that in recent games, the relationship has dropped off massively. The latest GT500 cars to appear in the series are from 2016, and outside of Gran Turismo, things aren't much better. It turns out that Sega arcade game is actually the title with the most recent Super GT roster. Or at least it was when I made that video, because just a few weeks after I posted it, Project Motor Racing brought out their GT500 DLC pack. It's incredible to think, but this game is currently the only title to have official GT500 cars from this decade. But even then, things aren't so simple. Not only do most of the cars not even have any official liveries, but this DLC was briefly delisted before coming back online with all mentions of GT500 removed. Clearly there was some sort of licensing issue, and that's interesting because it implies that one of the reasons why modern Super GT cars are in so few racing games is because including them isn't as easy as it used to be. Well, excluding Gran Turismo. They literally have a partnership with Super GT, so there are no excuses. Considering everything, I don't think I'm alone in wishing that there was a dedicated Super GT title, like we have for F1, WRC, MotoGP, NASCAR, etc. Honestly, this is something that I've wanted for quite a while, and a couple of years ago, I started to seriously think about how I would go about designing a game like that. But the more I expanded on my ideas, the more I realized that the concept was too good to just keep to myself. Today, I'm going to fully map out what my dream Super GT game would look like. From the content, to the features, different game modes, and more. My goal is not just to design the best Super GT game ever, because frankly that's a pretty low bar, but to design the greatest game licensed on a real-life racing series, full stop. I know that's an extremely bold target, but by leveraging what makes Super GT so amazing in real life, I truly believe that it can be achieved. So then, let me start by outlining the premise of this hypothetical project. It's a racing game based on the 2026 Super GT season, with all of the officially licensed cars, tracks, teams, and drivers. The next thing I want to establish is who the target audience of this game would be, and how that would affect its overall direction. Realistically, if this game were to be made, Japanese players would be the core demographic. While Super GT is still a fairly niche championship to those of us in the West, that's not the case in its homeland. Over there, it is the largest domestic racing series. You can kind of think of it as like Japan's NASCAR in terms of its general popularity and wider visibility. It has plenty of more casual viewers, families, young children, or just people who aren't serious motorsport fans but still follow the races. As such, I think it makes sense to try and cast a wide net with this game. In terms of a general template, I envision the Codemasters Formula 1 games. Whilst they do get a lot of flack for various things, one aspect that I think they do well is how they balance simulation-style handling with being easy to pick up and play. Whilst a more focused experience, in the vein of say Le Mans Ultimates, could also work very well, I feel like going down a balanced route would be more appropriate. Naturally, there would be a full suite of driving assists and difficulty options that players have come to expect. The goal is that no matter your level of skill, whether you're playing on a full rig or just a gamepad, you'll still be able to have the type of experience that you want. All of the assets in the game would be of a similar level of quality as in those F1 titles too. Good by current standards, but not on the cutting edge of technology. This trade-off would make development quicker, easier, and cheaper, and that will be important when considering what I have planned. Content-wise, this is pretty simple. We would have the 3 current GT500 machines from Honda, Nissan, and Toyota, as well as the 14 different models that can be found in GT300, making 17 unique cars in total. As you would expect, every team would be represented to make a full grid of 43 cars. In terms of tracks, all 7 different locations from the 2026 calendar would feature, including the cancelled round at Sepang, because we might as well. So that's the general outline, but what would the on-track experience be like? When it comes to this style of racing game, I believe that the AI opponents are one of the most important factors, and so it's imperative that they're done well. As we know, Super GT is a multi-class series, and so the AI's ability to deal with traffic will be crucial. At the same time, I don't want them to just act like clinical robots who never make mistakes. Part of the charm of real Super GT is that with so many cars on track at the same time, accidents do happen. I would like the AI to make driving errors from time to time, but in ways that actually feel believable. The idea is that I want the races in this game to be as exciting and unpredictable as real Super GT often is. To feed into this, there would be an option for car damage. On the visual front, it would be as much as we could get away with. Manufacturers are quite opposed to seeing their cars getting totally wrecked, so this would likely take the form of bumpers, wings, and wheels coming off, but nothing structural. Mechanical damage is where I would invest more effort, with the ability for different parts of the car to have issues and fail, such as the engine, transmission, brakes, suspension, tyres, etc. These can lead to full retirement, but if the damage isn't severe, you would also have the ability to do repairs in the pits. Of course, all of this would apply to the AI as well as the player, and I would also like to have resulting safety cars, full course yellows, and even red flags depending on the severity of on-track incidents. I'm always a fan of having changeable weather in the mix, and one idea I have is that it could rain so much to the point that the race might be stopped due to the conditions. This is something that does happen in real life, but to prevent it from getting annoying, it would only be a very rare occurrence in-game. You could almost consider it an Easter egg. I think that this combination of factors would lead to some really exciting and unpredictable races that feel authentic to Super GT. However, depending on the game mode, many of these options could also be disabled if you want a more straightforward experience. One thing I've yet to mention is that in a Super GT race, each car is driven by 2 or even sometimes 3 different drivers. The way I would handle this is that for the most part, you would be able to choose whether you want to control the car for the entire race across each driver, or you control just one of the drivers with an AI taking over for the rest. When you're not driving, you would be able to watch the race as a spectator or have the game simulate it, with maybe a short highlights reel showing what happened whilst you weren't driving. I think that giving players the option to choose how they want to handle this is the best approach. The only exception would be in career mode, where you'd be locked to controlling just the single driver, because otherwise it wouldn't really make sense. When you're not driving, I think it would be cool to have some commentary, just like in a real race. This would be fairly basic, commenting on things like key overtakes, accidents, pit stops, and retirements. When you are driving, the voice in your ear would instead be from a race engineer. Again, if you played Codemasters F1 games, this will be very familiar. Said engineer would provide useful information, and you'd be able to communicate with them whilst driving via a multifunction display. In terms of an overall theme, I would like the game to have a broadcast-style appearance. To demonstrate what I mean, let's look at F1 Championship Edition on the PS3. Based on the 2006 season, playing this game really feels like being transported back in time in a way that a lot of other similar racing games don't. One of the main ways in which it achieves this is in how the in-race UI adapts the on-screen graphics that were shown during the races back then. This is something that I would want to tap into with my Super GT game to give it a pronounced visual style, whilst also tying it more to the real-life series. There are other aspects that I would like to mirror too, such as playing the opening movie from the IRL broadcast when loading into a race, or the starting grid animation being based on the one from real life. Of course, there would also be the ability to skip these and just get straight into the race, with an optional pace lap for added realism. For racing games like these, being able to roleplay as a driver is one of the biggest draws, and I have many ideas for how I would make an engaging and authentic career mode in my Super GT game. When you first begin the career, you would have the option to choose what point you start from. For example, you could decide to begin right from the bottom of the ladder with a GT300 backmarker. Potentially, there could even be the option to start as a third driver who can only race in the 2 long-distance events. Alternatively, you could sign with a GT300 or GT500 frontrunner if you want to get in a competitive car straight away. Again, it's all about tailoring the experience to what each player wants, and also how many seasons they intend to do. Race distances could also be scaled down, allowing you to progress further in a shorter amount of time. One thing that's always tough to gauge when you pick up a new racing game is what difficulty you should have the AI set to. Ideally, I would like to use the approach of a sliding scale that you can adjust incrementally, but finding the perfect balance with these is always tricky. Something that could help with this would be a feature that tracks your driving during the career, and then gives you a suggested difficulty level based on how skilled it thinks you are. As you play, it would continue to assess you and update its suggestion. Of course, you could just ignore this and choose whatever difficulty you want, but this would give you a useful baseline. In truth, I'm not sure how easy a feature like this would be to implement. It would have to be based on an average pace across many different variables, including the track, the car, the weather, and more. To do this, we could use the AI's relative speed in those conditions as a benchmark, but in that case, it would be even more important to balance them well. There's nothing more annoying than a game where at one track you're miles ahead of your opponents, but then at another you're getting totally destroyed. The format of the career would be as expected, racing through multiple seasons of Super GT with all of the same rules and regulations to contend with. These include the qualifying and race formats, strategic options with tyre changes and refueling, the point system, and performance handicaps like success ballast and fuel restrictors. All of the things that add depth to real Super GT. Another aspect to this is the relative performance of each team. In real life, there is a hierarchy dictating which cars you're likely to see near the front, and which tend to be near the back. In fact, this is the main reason why the beginning of the 2026 season has admittedly been a bit flat, because Toms, and the Toyotas in general, are the clear benchmark in GT500. This performance spread would be reflected in-game across each of the different modes, including career. At least, to begin with. When it comes to a multiple-year career mode, I think it's much more engaging if the performance hierarchy can change over time. The way that many other licensed racing games handle this is through driver-led car development. However, this idea doesn't really work when applied to Super GT. GT300 is governed by balance of performance, whereas in GT500, it's up to the manufacturers to develop the cars, not the individual teams. Tyre development is a factor, but given that the series is switching to a single tyre make formula from 2027, that's soon to be irrelevant, so I'm choosing not to consider it. Of course, we could just ignore all of this and go with the development tree approach anyway, but I've come up with a better solution. In real life, when it comes to what makes one team more competitive than another using an equivalent car, it mainly comes down to the people and processes they put in place to maximize performance. Translating this into a racing game, I'm actually going to adapt an idea previously used by Codemasters. Prior to the introduction of proper car development in F1 2016, a few of their earlier games used a system where each team in the career would be separated into different tiers based on relative performance. At the end of each season, the teams that finished with the most points in their given tiers would be promoted to the one above, which made their car faster, and the teams at the bottom of each tier would be demoted to the one below, making them slower. Oddly, this system was never disclosed to players, and is only fully understood now because people look through the game's data. With my Super GT game, what I would like to do is have a more granular take on this idea. Effectively, performance changes would be dictated by how each team fares relative to their expected performance. So for instance, a backmarker team would have much lower expectations, meaning that if you drive for them, you have a much higher chance of exceeding those expectations, and thus making their car faster. Conversely, a top team would already have very high standards, and so anything short of race wins and championships would be considered a disappointment and result in a slight reduction in performance. The idea is that this simulates the transfer of talented people towards teams that are viewed as on the rise, and that includes drivers too. This means that as a player, rather than just trying to get yourself into a top team as quickly as possible, another strategy would be to help your current team up the ladder by consistently performing well. Of course, as each team's performance adjusts, so do their expectations, allowing the process to work both ways. Ideally, I would want these changes to be noticeable from season to season, but not overly drastic. I wouldn't want to see teams go from frontrunners to backmarkers and vice versa over the course of 1 year, but rather have a more gradual shift over several seasons. As a player, you should be able to pick up on these trends and plan your own career moves accordingly. Another important factor that dictates results is driver ability. Each AI driver would be rated differently relative to their real-life performance, and this too will change over time. Younger drivers will gradually improve, whereas older ones will taper off and eventually retire. To go with this, AI driver transfers would also be possible. What form this takes depends on what would be possible from a legal standpoint. Manufacturers might not be too happy seeing their drivers racing for other brands. But if that's the case, then we can still have driver moves within the same stable, such as Toyota drivers switching to other Toyota teams. Ideally, I'd want driver transfers to be totally open-ended, but even in that case, brand lines would still play a factor in making them feel authentic. For instance, having driven for Honda Team Real Racing for 18 consecutive years, Kodaisuke Koshi isn't suddenly going to move to, say, Nismo. Team and brand loyalty is a major part of Real Super GT, and it would also play a role in my game. That's not to say that unexpected moves couldn't occur, but I want it to feel believable and also understandable when they do. In games like these, driver transfers just sort of happen with no prior warning. But in real life, that's not how it plays out. There's an ever-evolving landscape of rumours and speculation prior to a move, and I want that to be true in this game. What I envision is a news section that you can view at any point during the career which reports on the latest information, including possible driver moves. I feel like this could add some colour to these situations by explaining why a move might happen, such as a certain driver not being happy at their current team for whatever reason, or a key retirement which creates an empty seat. As a player, you would then be able to use this information to decide which teams to approach in your own negotiations. Of course, not every rumour will be true, just like in real life. But as they say, there's no smoke without fire. However, even if there is an opening, it doesn't mean that you'll automatically get it. Much like with the AI drivers, you'd be given a reputation rating that dictates how each of the teams view you. In a lot of other racing games, your standing is almost entirely results-based. What position did you qualify, and what position did you finish? However, when you share a car with another driver, that system could be messy. For example, say you have an incredible stint, only to hand over to your teammate who then throws it off the road. In that case, the end result is not at all reflective of your personal performance. The same can also be true if you have a mechanical failure, or get involved in an accident that wasn't your fault. What I would want to do is have your reputation as a driver influenced by your actual performance, as well as your results. You see, the system I mentioned earlier, where the game tracks your speed and suggests an appropriate AI difficulty, could also be applied here. Basically, the game would look at your pace relative to the variables in the AI difficulty you're racing on, and then factor in things like the number of positions gained or lost, number of major mistakes made, etc., and then determine how well you performed in that race, irrespective of the end result. This rating would then be combined with a results modifier to give you your reputation that dictates how you're viewed by each of the teams. I think that this method would make things a lot fairer, while still taking results into consideration. Another idea I have that could work alongside this is for a positive trait system. The game could assess specific aspects of the way you race to give you a leg up. For example, if you always make up positions at the start of a race, you could get the fast starter trait. Or if you rarely get involved in accidents, there could be a clean driver trait. These traits would act as modifiers to your overall reputation, and thus make you more appealing to certain teams. It's quite well known that the boss of Impel, Kazuyoshi Hoshino, favours more aggressive drivers who would always go for the move. So if the game determines you to be a driver like this, you could get the hard charger trait. Having this means that even if your reputation is lower than ideal, teams like Impel who value that trait view you in a higher standing, and you're more likely to be offered a contract with them. Each team could have different traits which they prioritize, adding another layer of variability to your career. As in real life, the easiest way to get into GT500 would be to become associated with one of the 3 manufacturers, Honda, Nissan or Toyota. To get on their radar would require you to perform well and increase your reputation, but this could also be accelerated by racing for affiliated teams in GT300. This might all sound overly complicated, but the bottom line is that if you drive well, you will end up in a top GT500 team eventually. Positive traits and brand affiliations not only expedite the process, but if you have a favourite team that you really want to drive for, you can also use these to carve a pathway into their car. So, that's what my ideal Super GT career mode would look like. But in saying all that, I'm not quite done. Because, what do you do once you've won everything there is to win in the career? Well, you try and win with your own team. Once again taking inspiration from Codemasters F1 games, I would like to present a Super GT My Team mode. Now, there are a couple of major differences in how I would like this to work. For one, I want the team creation element to be integrated into the driver career rather than being its own standalone mode. By doing it this way, if you choose to start from the bottom of the ladder, you can have a complete path from GT300 driver to GT500 driver, and then GT300 team owner and GT500 team owner. If you can pull it off and win championships both as a driver and team owner, it would be the ultimate rags to riches story. Personally, that's what I'd want to do. Alternatively, in the same way that you can choose which team to start with as a driver, I'd also like there to be the ability to jump into team ownership from the start of the career. If that's what interests you the most, then I see no reason to not allow people to do this. Assuming that you start as just a driver, at a certain point in the career you will unlock the ability to start a team. This would most likely be linked to your driver reputation and experience. Once you do start a team, you have a few tasks, the first of which being to find some sponsors. In Super GT, the title sponsor is a big deal. Just think about Calsonic, Autobax, Denso, and many more. For me, fake sponsors are not acceptable. They have to be real. I picture these being a mixture of international brands and also Japan-specific ones, both car-related and non-car related. I remember that when my team was first unveiled for F1 2020, the excuse they gave for having fake brands is that real ones didn't approve of them being rated against each other in terms of the money they were offering. This seemed odd to me given that other Codemasters games did exactly that, such as Race Driver Grid, and even more bizarrely, Dirt 4 just a few years earlier. Overall, it seemed like a bit of a cop-out. In my game, the variety of sponsors to choose from and the terms of the deal they offer will again be dependent on reputation, but I would like there to be some sort of loyalty mechanic. This means that sticking with a title sponsor will result in them offering more money, thus making it viable to continue with that same sponsor for multiple seasons as your team grows. After all, many of the sponsors that we consider as iconic to certain teams are mainly down to the longevity of the partnership. Of course, there will also be the ability to set your team name, number, and colour scheme. Whilst I'd love for there to be a full livery editor, realistically we'd probably have to settle for a number of preset designs which you can alter the colours of. Next up, you would need to hire key personnel, such as mechanics, engineers, and of course, a teammate. Once again, options are limited based on reputation and also the money you have available. And it's that latter factor that will also determine your choice of GT300 car. Generally speaking, older models will be less expensive, but also somewhat limited when it comes to their potential. And with that, your team has now been set up. Beyond this point, you'll have to manage finances between income from sponsors and prize money, as well as your expenses. These include staff wages, as well as car maintenance and repairs. Yes, any damage you do to your car on track comes directly out of your pockets. In theory, if you end up severely in debt, you could be forced to miss races if your car gets totaled, or even sell the team entirely and revert back to being just a driver. Conversely, if your team ends up being successful, you could start expanding. This can take many forms, and how you go about it would be up to you. The most obvious path would be to move your team up to GT500. Doing this requires a higher reputation, as well as an increased budget. Just like with being a driver, if you establish a relationship with one of the manufacturers, that will make the jump easier. This could be achieved if you previously raced for them before you started your own team, or if you're campaigning one of their cars in GT300. Alternatively, you could choose to field one of their junior drivers in your car, and that would also put you in good standing with them. When you move up to GT500, you will have access to more options when it comes to potential sponsors as well as team members, reflecting your team's increased profile. But you don't have to go down this route if you don't want to. If you find out that you've got quite a surplus in budget, you could decide to expand to a 2-car operation. The second car would be treated separately from the first, with its own crew, drivers, and title sponsor, and you'd be able to choose which one you want to drive. Whilst to begin with, you'll have both cars in GT300, potentially you could later have one in GT300 and one in GT500, or even both in GT500. When it comes to real Super GT, there are currently teams that fall into each of those categories, so this is entirely grounded in reality. And do you know what else is grounded in reality? Teams designing and building their own cars. Super GT is one of the few major motorsport events that still allows privateer outfits to enter their own original creations. Even though FIA GT3 cars make up the majority of the GT300 field, there are still a number of unique models to be found, such as the BRZ, LC500, and Nissan Z to name a few. In what would be easily the most ambitious part of this career mode, I would like players to be able to create their own original GT300 cars. Here's how this could work. As the hypothetical creators of this game, we would include a few fictional GT300 models to use as a basis. The easiest comparison to make here would be with how Gran Turismo often designs original race cars specifically for their games. A few that I came up with are the ND Mazda Roadster, 6th generation Honda Prelude, Lotus Emira, and 5th gen Toyota Prius. As you might be able to tell, most of those are inspired by past GT300 machines. The basic body design of these cars would be set in stone, but players would have some freedom when it comes to the details. For instance, there would be multiple different variations for stuff like the bumpers, rear wing, and also the wheel design, which players could mix and match. These would have no impact in terms of performance. They would merely be cosmetic options that you could change to suit your own tastes. As for how they come about from an in-universe perspective, I have two ideas. Either it could be framed as your team becoming a constructor and designing and building the car yourself, or you could commission the car for someone else to build. With the latter, that could fall to one of the many well-known Japanese constructors, like APR, Dome, or Mooncraft. If you were to design it yourself, you could possibly have some input when it comes to performance characteristics, such as deciding the balance between straight line speed and cornering ability. If you were to commission it, maybe these traits would be dependent on which constructor you choose to build the car for you, with them each having their own pros and cons. As the engine only needs to be from within the same brand as the car itself, there could be multiple options there too. As for the performance of the end product, this would be dependent on how much money you put into R&D, as well as how long you spend developing it. If you don't invest in either of these areas enough, the car could come out underbaked. This would result in its speed and reliability being relatively poor due to a lack of optimization, which can only be addressed by using it in races and gathering more data. Even if you were to maximize the development of it though, there would still be some room for improvement once it hits the track. Alongside this, we could also include a handful of GT3 cars that don't currently race in Super GT, for players to purchase and enter under their own team if they want to. I'm thinking of stuff like the C8 Corvette, Ford Mustang, McLaren 720S, and more. The scope of these other GT3 machines, as well as the options when it comes to building your own original GT300 car, means that the possibilities with this mode are almost limitless. In theory, the team management side could be so in-depth that retiring as a driver and running your team full-time could be an option for those who want it. Okay, now we're done with career mode for real. Undoubtedly, career would be the core of this game's single-player experience, but I do have an idea for a second flagship game mode. In racing games like these, classic content is always something that fans appreciate. Being able to drive iconic cars and tracks from the series past provides a distinctly different appeal from the contemporary stuff. However, I often find the execution of this content to be quite underwhelming. In most cases, these cars are just a gimmick, something to mess around with before you inevitably get bored and head back to the main game. They often have very little utility beyond time trials, and in the instances where you do actually get to race them, it's either a one-make affair, or you have various cars from different years thrown together. The problem is that there usually isn't enough depth in the selection to do anything interesting with them from a game design perspective. With my dream Super GT game, I would aim to show what's really possible here, and to do this, I've come up with Legacy Mode. This game mode is entirely centered on older JGTC and Super GT content, with the goal being to make the best possible use of it that we can. How I intend to do this is that instead of including a handful of cars and tracks from various different eras, like most other games do, we instead pick out a few specific years, and then feature each of the cars and tracks from that season. In total, I have selected 7 seasons, labelled as eras, running from 1996 to 2020, with a 4-year interval between each of them. By including the cars, tracks, teams, and drivers from these specific years, we would be able to portray each era of the series in-game. Now, you might be thinking that for a side mode, this would be incredibly ambitious, and that's because it is. But at the same time, I believe that with some effort, it could actually be done. When it comes to the tracks, we already have 7 from the current 2026 season. In real life, most of their layouts have barely changed in the past 30 years, and so they could be reused with only minor alterations. The only major exception would be Fuji Speedway, which would need to be totally remodeled for its pre-2005 variant. Alongside that, we would only need to recreate 6 more tracks from scratch to have all the circuits we would need for our 7 chosen years. That makes just 14 tracks in total, and considering that 2 of those only hosted non-championship races, they could be dropped if necessary. Yes, we would only need to model half as many tracks as what you'll find on the current Formula 1 calendar to include every single circuit that this championship has raced at over the past 3 decades. That's kind of mind-blowing, and also incredibly helpful when it comes to designing this game. Looking at the cars, that's where things get trickier. Considering the 7 years that I chose, what I did was count up the number of distinct models that competed in at least half of the races within each of those seasons, not including different teams and liveries. The total number of cars comes to around 120, which is admittedly quite a lot for a game of this scale. However, that is factoring in cars which appear in multiple seasons as slightly different variations, and as such wouldn't need to be remodeled from scratch. Taking those out of the equation, the number would be closer to 95, which is still a lot, but not totally beyond the realms of possibility. I'll talk more later about how a possible content roadmap could work here, but for now, let's just continue assuming that we have those 14 circuits and 120-something cars. Okay, so that's the content, but how would it all be used within Legacy Mode? The basic idea is that this mode would have you racing through each of these 7 eras in chronological order. The gameplay would take the form of a championship format. You simply choose which team and car you want to race for, and from there you compete in a full season that mirrors what took place in real life. Using 2008 as an example, this would be a 9-event calendar that looks like this. Naturally, all of your opponents would be the teams and drivers from this year, with their relative performance from real life being replicated as well. This setup is another reason why I chose to omit one-off entries and only include cars that race for the majority of the respective season. In cases where the real-life driver lineup of a team changed during the course of the year, for the sake of simplicity, we would just stick with the lineup that was used in the most races. The goal of Legacy Mode is to try and transport players back in time and show them how the series has changed over the years. In that sense, using the cars and tracks from these seasons is just part of the wider picture. All of the major rules and regulations would be mimicked too. These include qualifying in race formats, how success handicaps are handled, safety car procedures, etc. Effectively, all of the considerations we made in how we depict 2026 Super GT would be applied to each era independently to make the experience as authentic as reasonably possible. Other examples of this include adjusting the rate of mechanical failures, safety cars, and certain concepts such as full course yellows not existing at all. In fact, in the JGTC days, they would often just leave retired cars at the side of the track if they weren't deemed to be in a dangerous position, so this could be replicated too. Another idea is that weather reports could be less accurate in earlier seasons, adding both realism and a different gameplay challenge. Honestly, the number of ideas you could come up with for this mode are almost endless. In outlining how I wanted this game to feel, I talked about having an authentic broadcast style appearance, and that applies for this mode too. All of the things I mentioned before, such as the pre-race intros, starting grid animation, and the appearance of the UI, would be either directly lifted from real-life broadcasts, or remade in a very similar style. This would give each era its own personality, whilst being a fun nostalgia trip for anyone who remembers watching the races at the time. Upon finishing a full season, you would have the ability to move on to the next era, but you could choose to replay the current one as well. This is to give players an opportunity to race in both GT300 and GT500, with a maximum of 3 seasons in each era allowed before you have to move on to the next. When you do make the transition, there would be a short cutscene explaining what happened in real life during the intervening years. This would also outline how the cars have evolved and any major rule changes that you would need to be aware of. Go through this process for all 7 eras, and you would have successfully completed Legacy Mode. Like I said, this mode would be secondary to the main career, so your results wouldn't really affect anything. It's more about just experiencing the different eras of the series, and driving the cars that appeal to you the most, regardless of performance. Either way, I feel confident in saying that a game mode like this would truly validate the inclusion of classic cars and tracks, in a way that a lot of other racing games simply don't. Beyond career and legacy mode, there are a few other minor aspects that I wanted to touch on. The classic cars and tracks would be available in other parts of the game, such as Custom Race and Custom Championship. These are the game's free play modes. There would of course be presets for you to load up races that are authentic to real life, whether that be for the 2026 season or any of the earlier ones from Legacy mode. But at the same time, you would have free reign to customize things however you want to. You could race the current cars at classic tracks, make custom grids with cars from different eras, and mix and match different rules and race formats to create something totally unique. It would effectively be a sandbox where you could do whatever you wanted to with the game's content. In fact, you could set up these interesting scenarios and just watch how the AI deals with them in spectator mode, inspired by a similar option in F1 Championship Edition. Just sit back, relax, and let the chaos unfold. As you can probably tell, this would be a single-player focused game, but online play would obviously be present. Open lobbies, private lobbies, and ranked multiplayer would all be options. I would also like to have a co-op career mode in a similar vein to the recent F1 games. You could compete alongside a friend in different cars as rivals, or as teammates within the same car. I feel like there would be some really interesting stuff you could do with that concept. And with that, we're pretty much done. I've covered all of the main points that I set out to with this video, but there will always be a few aspects that I didn't mention or elaborate very much on, either because I didn't have anything interesting to add, or because I felt like they were too insignificant. Bear in mind that all of this comes from an outsider's perspective. I have never attended a Super GT race in person, let alone worked within the series. If I were to actually make this game, there would be a fairly extensive research phase in which I experience the racing in person, and also talk with people who are involved in it. Drivers, team owners, etc. Doing this would allow me to make the game even more authentic, and potentially help me to come up with new gameplay ideas. With all of that said, let's discuss how this game could become a reality. Now, I am under no illusions that a project of this scope could just suddenly appear out of the blue. The initial form of this game would most likely be pretty basic. My ideal roadmap is that rather than being an annual release, there would be a new game every 2 or 3 years. This would allow for more substantial changes and additions to be made over time, eventually culminating in what I've described here. Realistically, it's something that would have to be built up to over several years and multiple games, especially when considering Legacy mode. As much as I would prefer them to be available to everyone, the classic cars and tracks would most likely come as paid DLC, to help offset the development costs. Parallels can of course be drawn with many other racing games in this style. Whilst it would be nice to envision a game like this with a level of funding and support akin to say Gran Turismo, that simply isn't going to happen. Not unless Polyphony Digital themselves decide to make their own Super GT game. What I'm trying to say is that, barring any miracles, a licensed Super GT game will never be given enough resources to create what I've outlined here. But that's okay. Because, to be honest, even if there was a Super GT game that only took a fraction of what I've shown you today, I'd still be happy with that. For as much as I love the older Gran Turismos for how they heightened the profile of the series outside of Japan, they're not a particularly great representation of real Super GT. That's because, whilst Gran Turismo is a great driving game, it's always been kind of a mediocre racing game. When you're on track, oftentimes nothing really happens. It is just cars going around in circles. For me, that's not what Super GT is about. There should be drama, there should be excitement, there should be multi-class racing at least. That's what the series is about. As such, even if we weren't in the position that we are now, where Super GT cars in racing games are few and far between, I'd still say that a game like this should be made. As a motorsport discipline, Super GT is too distinct to only exist as content in games not focused on it, where it's treated just like any other generic racing series. As I hope that I've shown you with this video, when you fully lean into what makes the real series so good, you would be able to produce a truly exceptional racing game. It's one of those things where the more I think about it, the more it just makes sense. Japan is massive in the world of gaming, and they also have a huge passion for their biggest domestic racing series. Putting the two together is surely a no-brainer, and I think it would make a lot of people very happy. So, if the chairman of the GT Association who runs the real-life series, Masahi Bando, is watching this video, spoilers, he isn't, I would tell him to seriously consider making a game like this a reality. Or at the very least, as close to a reality as we can ever hope for.